9 aliens who come to Earth, and they're all really, really hot. And he's the hottest. And he meets a girl who looked weirdly like me, and whose name was one of my middle names. So it was basically like a self-insert sci-fi romance I wrote when I was a teenager. This Italian man came rushing up to me, and he started talking to me in Italian, and I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't speak Italian. And he was like, oh, you're English. Now, normally, people do not react to English people like this. They normally say, your country did something horrible to mine. And I was like, oh, tell me about it. I found it so fascinating to be able to write about things that started happening in the real world as I was writing it. There's quite a difficult scene in the 3rd Bone Season book where the character is waterboarded. And I wrote that around the time that there was a conversation happening in America about people being subjected to what was called enhanced interrogation, which is just a nice word for torture, basically. And it is quite an odd thing. You become a kind of unintentional oracle sometimes. You'll write about something and then see it happening in the real world. I was always thinking how difficult it must have been for my ancestors, because they left during the Great Hunger in Ireland, which was a famine that was engineered by England because they kept shipping food out of Ireland even though they knew the Irish people were starving. And I always thought how hard it must have been for my ancestors to set sail from Ireland and go to live in the country of their own oppressor.
Samantha, thank you again for coming to us. I hope you're having a good time.
Yeah, I am. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time in Slovenia, and it's really wonderful so far. I'm very excited to be here.
An important question to start with. Now that you've been in Ljubljana for a day, have you found our Dragon Bridge?
Oh, that was the first thing I went to, yeah. No, I looked on the map, and literally the first thing I saw was Dragon Bridge, and I was like, well, I've got to go there straight away. So immediately ran there and took about 500 photos. But yeah, no, it's awesome. I was looking up the dragon mythology of the city. It's so lovely that actually so many European countries have some version of the Dragon Slayer story. But yeah, it was really cool, especially the link with Greek mythology as well.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite dragon myth?
I quite like the one about the Wawel dragon in Poland, in Krakow specifically. Like, I really like that one. I like the legend of St. George and the dragon because it was what inspired me to write The Priory of the Orange Tree. But I'm very critical of it in Priory. So I guess I find it interesting rather than liking it, per se.
Awesome. So, let's start with your work. So you write both dystopian fantasy and epic fantasy. Do you like either of these more than the other? Have you found like a home in one of these more than in the other?
It's tricky because I really like elements of both. My favorite of my series is The Bone Season. I think because it is my baby, it's the first book I ever wrote, and I love the characters so much, and they've been with me for such a long time. Like, I came up with one of the characters when I was 15, and I'm now 34. So I've actually lived longer with him in my head than without him in my head. But I think that epic fantasy has its own amazing things about it, and Priory is special to me in its own way as well. And it was a very important part of my life journey. I think with dystopia, I'm working within certain restrictions. So it's a dystopia based in our world, or a version of our world. So I do have to work by geographical guidelines, for example, which is why I do a lot of traveling to research. You know, I like to go to the cities that I'm writing about and actually walk around them. Whereas with epic fantasy, I can just completely make it up from scratch, which is very exciting, but also in a way a bit harder because, you know, I can, if I need to, I don't know, create a valley, I can do that, but then I need to think about things like, you know, rivers needing a source, for example. Like, I need to think about how rivers flow and how coastlines are formed. So it's kind of more freeing, but also harder. Like, it requires a bit more brain capacity. I do like that you can mirror the real world through both in various ways.
So what makes you choose the locations that you do choose in your, let's say, in the bone season?
So with the Bone season, it was always going to start in London, and the first book is set between London and Oxford. I grew up in London, and I studied at Oxford University. So when I was at Oxford, I started writing the book, and I was imagining this contrast between the two cities. London I just love because it's so many layers of history piled on top of each other. Like, you can go to London and see something that was built a year ago, but then you might see a bit of a Roman wall or something from, you know, the 12th century or the 16th century. It's like an onion in that way. And then Oxford, I wanted to interrogate academic life, and it's almost a bit like a satire of university life. Like, the clairvoyants are taking exams, but their exams, if they fail them, may result in death. But that's sometimes how you feel when you're at school at university, that your life is going to be over if you don't pass your exams. So that was, in the first two, those were always going to be the two cities that the main character is kind of torn between. And then there are other places that I just love and wanted to explore, and some places just feel like bone season cities. Like Paris was always going to be one because it has the catacombs, and it just felt like this. It's the contrast between kind of the dirty, gritty bones and kind of passages with the glamour of Paris, like this kind of over-the-top ostentatiousness of it. So that was always going to be a bone season city. And then when I went to Venice and various other places, I just get this little tingle, like, this is definitely a bone season city. So yeah, it's kind of a gut thing mixed with specific places and ideas that I think are interesting to explore.
Yeah. Which location has been your favorite to write about?
That's really tricky because I love all of them so much. I would say, actually, Orvieto, which is kind of a hidden gem in Italy. It's a beautiful city on a hill, and it's got these beautiful golden buildings that almost look like they're made out of honeycomb. And I just had the most fascinating experience of doing my research there. It was this really long research trip I went on for the 5th Bone Season book. And I went to Venice, Naples, Rome, and Orvieto, so it's quite a long trip. And it was boiling hot, and each city was so different from the next. Like, Naples was nothing like what I'd imagined Naples to be like. Like, it's incredibly loud and overwhelming and boiling hot. And then I went to Orvieto, and basically, I found Orvieto by typing into Google romantic Italian city because I needed somewhere for my characters to have a romance scene. And I really wanted it to be somewhere very beautiful and like very classically Italian feeling. And I found Orvieto, and inside the hill, there are these like ancient caves and quarries, and people would use them to escape from the city if it was ever under siege. And then it has this beautiful place called St. Patrick's Well, which is this incredible marvel. This Italian man came rushing up to me, and he started talking to me in Italian, and I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't speak Italian. And he was like, oh, you're English. Now, normally, people do not react to English people like this. They normally say, your country did something horrible to mine. And I was like, oh, tell me about it, which we deserve because we don't get taught about these things. But this guy was super excited that I was English because he loved English military history. And he was like, do you know the Tudors? I was like, famously, yes, I do know the Tudors. So he ended up taking me for like a cup of tea in a cafe. And I'm not someone who normally goes for a cup of tea with a complete stranger, but he had this huge energy, so I was kind of fascinated by him. And we ended up having this like really interesting chat, and he told me that he used to be like in the fire department in Orvieto, and like he just gave me like a 2-hour lesson in the history of Orvieto, and then we just went our separate ways. And it was just quite a sweet experience, really, just a local person just like really warmly embracing me and wanting to show me around.
It's always charming when you have experiences like that. It's really great.
Yeah, it's very rare.
Yeah. Speaking of histories, Ireland and England also have a history. How was incorporating that into your dystopian fantasy?
Yeah, so one very dystopian thing about Britain and particularly England is that we do not really get taught our own history. The British government would prefer that British people never think the British Empire was a bad thing. And they like us to think that the British Empire was all about giving people trains and civilization, and we never did anything bad at all. And all of the bad things we did get swept under the carpet. We also don't really learn about our history with our closest neighbours, so Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. I probably know more about France than I do about Ireland just from school. Everything I know about Ireland I've taught myself. So we don't really know about the horrible colonial history between England and its neighbours. I am descended from Irish people from County Roscommon on my father's side. And I have an Irish surname, but my surname is an anglicisation of a Gaeilge surname, and I don't actually know what my actual surname is supposed to be because it got mangled by some English scribe at some point. And I was really interested in exploring the experience of being connected to a country while not really knowing anything about it and never having lived there. And I was always thinking how difficult it must have been for my ancestors because they left during the Great Hunger in Ireland, which was a famine that was engineered by England because they kept shipping food out of Ireland even though they knew the Irish people were starving. And I always thought how hard it must have been for my ancestors to set sail from Ireland and go to live in the country of their own oppressor. I've always imagined that perhaps they couldn't afford to go to America or anywhere else, so they had to go to England. And I really wanted to explore that experience, so I decided to write The Bone Season from the perspective of a young Irish woman who left Ireland when she was young. And she does speak the Irish language, and she is trying to cling to her connection to Ireland, but she has been forcibly estranged from it. So I thought it was kind of a way to explore a kind of microcosm of what happened to my family over generations, like being separated from a country and slowly losing the language, the heritage, until there's really nothing left but the name.
Yeah. So The Bone Season is a dystopian fantasy. Did anything in particular inspire you to write this as a dystopia?
It was partly my experience of Oxford. Oxford normally gets written about as a very magical place when it's written about, and I didn't feel like that when I was there. I felt really, really lonely and out of my depth, and it just felt like this very heavy, very oppressive environment. And so I was picturing the city through quite a dark lens, and I was imagining it as a kind of prison. And so it started there, and then I started thinking about things I wanted to explore, like, imperialism and colonialism, like government oppression, just things I had been interested in for a long time. I was also interested in the dystopian genre. It started with The Handmaid's Tale, which my English teachers gave to me when I was 18, and it really taught me about feminism and also about the dystopian genre. Also, one of my favourite books when I was young is a book called Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman, which is like a British dystopia. And I just loved those stories because they pushed characters to such an extreme that you wouldn't normally see. They're at the limits of their sanity, they're at the edge of survival. And I think under those circumstances, in that kind of pressure cooker, characters do such fascinating things. So I decided that it would be just really interesting to write this story that was about an empire founded by the gods and how human beings would respond to that. And the Bone Season series is partly a reimagining of Greek mythology, like various stories from Greek mythology. And I've always found the Greek gods quite terrifying, actually. They're very, they can be incredibly cruel and incredibly petty. So I thought, what if the gods kind of came to Earth and they created a second iteration of the British Empire? And what would one young Irish woman do in those circumstances? And I have really not enjoyed is a difficult word with dystopia, but I found it so fascinating to be able to write about things that started happening in the real world as I was writing it. There's quite a difficult scene in the third Bone Season book where the character is waterboarded. And I wrote that around the time that there was a conversation happening in America about people being subjected to what was called enhanced interrogation, which is just a nice word for torture, basically. And it is quite an odd thing. You become a kind of unintentional oracle sometimes. You'll write about something and then see it happening in the real world. In the next Bone Season book that I'm currently working on, for example, there's a scene that's set in America. And it so closely mirrors what's going on in America, but I didn't intend that. I planned it years ago, but it's kind of coming to life before my eyes. So it is a strange thing. You're just this kind of unintentional prophet.
Has there been any difference between writing the book set in Britain and having it set in America?
Oh, yeah. I mean, every single book with a different setting has been slightly different. You know, writing the book that's mostly set in Oxford was very different to the one fully set in London, very different to the one fully set in France and Italy. I'm very lucky that I have people who help me with the authenticity as well. So, for example, like in my French book, you know, I sent it to people who'd lived in France and who spoke French and asked them to check the translations and just to check that they didn't feel like this feels like an English person's idea of France, you know. And I'm so lucky that people give their time so generously to do that. Like they will just read sections of the book and just say, okay, maybe if you just change the dialogue a little bit here, it will feel a bit more natural. So London, the Mime Order, which is the book set in London, was probably the one I was most comfortable in because I've lived in London all my life and I was able to mix up the historical London with modern London and kind of play around with it a little bit. And then with the other countries, I always try to go there in person because I must see what I'm writing about. And yeah, it did give every book a very different vibe. Like the Italian book feels distinctly different from the others because it's set in the world outside the dystopia, even down to like the climate being very different from the other countries I'd written about. It feels like a kind of European road trip book, which I really enjoyed. And every book also has a slightly different genre within the series, so that helps every book to feel slightly different from the next one.
Has it been difficult in any way to set the book outside of this dystopia?
That was always something that I intended to do. So when I was reading other dystopias, so The Hunger Games, for example, when I was reading The Hunger Games, I was always asking myself, what does the rest of the world think of this? Like, or is the rest of the world just gone? Like, has there been some kind of nuclear disaster? Because it's very obvious that Panem is supposed to be America, but it's really unclear like what's happening in any other country. Like Suzanne Collins literally never, as far as I remember, mentions that Katniss even knows that there is anything beyond Panem at all. And then when I read The Handmaid's Tale, there's a really interesting moment where the main character, Offred, who is, you know, she's in this horrific kind of Christo-fascist regime, and she's been turned into a handmaid, like, which is essentially like a sex slave. And there's a scene where a woman from another country comes into the dystopia. And Offred's really shocked because the woman is wearing like nail polish, which she's not allowed to wear. And it's like Offred is like this tourist attraction almost to this woman who's visiting from elsewhere. And I had actually never seen that before because generally dystopias are by their nature very confined. And I was so fascinated by the idea of breaking that wall. So I always wanted the Bone Season to be a series that showed you multiple parts of the dystopia, but also how people outside are reacting to the dystopia. So I loved writing the 5th book and a section of the 6th book because I can show how other politicians are reacting to it, you know, how other countries are thinking, like, how do we deal with this expanding empire? That's, you know, how are we going to respond to it militarily? Like, how are we going to protect its people? Are we going to protect its people? So, yeah, I found that really interesting, and it was very different from the other books.
You mentioned earlier that one of the characters has been with you since you were 15. Did you create the story to revolve around the character, or did you have, like, an idea for the full story before that?
So actually, the character is Arcturus, who is the main love interest in the Bone Season series, and I actually created him for a different novel that I wrote when I was about 15. And it took me a few years. It was a very long novel, and it was basically about 9 aliens who come to Earth, and they're all really, really hot. And he's the hottest. And he meets a girl who looked weirdly like me and whose name was one of my middle names. So it was basically like a self-insert sci-fi romance I wrote when I was a teenager. And he was a really different character in this book. Before I discovered feminism, my ideas about what main love interest should be like was a little problematic. And he was really angry and really jealous and really possessive, which I apparently thought was really hot when I was 15, but I don't anymore. So when I wrote The Bone Season, it's a completely different book from the one I wrote when I was 15, but there were a couple of ideas that I developed in that book that I thought had some potential. So like the idea of the dreamscape, for example, which is quite prominent in The Bone Season. And specifically the character of Warden, or Arcturus. Even though his baseline personality needed a lot of work, like he needed about 50 years of therapy, he still had some potential for me. So I decided to kind of sort of copy-paste him into The Bone Season, but also completely rework his character. And then 10 years later, I actually went back and rewrote the Bone Season series, which my British publisher, by some miracle, allowed me to do. And then I reworked his personality again because my feminism had changed again. I needed him to be a green flag man. But yeah, so he's been in my head for a really long time in some form. And he has not been the main character in either iteration, but he's definitely the deuteragonist of the series. And I love writing his romance. It's like a very slow burn, very respectful kind of romance that's very much based on consent and equality. And I just love him. He's like my favorite character I've ever written.
So has romance always been planned to be in these books?
Oh, yeah. It was always going to be, I love forbidden love. It's like my absolute favorite romance trope. I very rarely write romance that is not forbidden in some way. It's not interesting to me if someone's not angry about it. So when I wrote The Bone Season, I knew it was going to be a forbidden love story between a god and a mortal. And I was so interested in that because how do you deal with a situation where one of you is definitely going to die and there is nothing that the other one can do about it? And it's not like a Twilight situation where he can just bite her and turn her into a vampire. It's not possible for that to happen. And I thought that would just be a really interesting engine to explore ideas about what it means to be human and what it means to be mortal, like to examine our relationship with death. So yeah, there was always going to be romance, and it's a very, very slow burn. Like if you haven't started it yet, you will be screaming at them to just kiss. But I like a slow burn because I don't really believe in a romance if it happens too quickly. I always need these people to like really care about each other, and there has to be genuine reasons that are keeping them apart. So yeah, that was always very much going to be a part of it, yeah.
In The Bone Season, because it's a dystopia, unfortunately there is a lot in it that reflects our current situation. But there are also a lot of things that are different from our world. Like, for instance, The Bone Season is queer normative, and there's not a patriarchy. Yeah. So what has it been like writing that, a setting where there are so many similarities with our world, but that's different in such fundamental ways?
Well, I'm actually really excited to explore that in the 6th book, because there is a moment where Paige, the main character, she's lived in this dystopia for a really long time. And she's now gone outside it, and she realizes that a lot of things outside the dystopia are actually worse than they are on the inside. So obviously the dystopia is bad because it executes people for certain reasons and it discriminates against people for certain reasons. But like you say, it's not a patriarchy. It is queer normative. There is not there's no racism. There is xenophobia, like there's like suspicion of outsiders, but genuinely, otherwise it is very, very equal. And Paige has to confront the idea of, well, what if the dystopia falls and something worse comes in? So that was really interesting to grapple with, because it's like in any major revolution, often before you get the intended outcome of something like democracy, you often get a period where something worse can come in. You know, you can overthrow a dictator, and then something worse or about the same comes in. And I wanted to grapple with all aspects of revolution, like the risk that you might be potentially making the situation worse rather than better. So that has been really interesting. And it has been quite nice to write a world without patriarchy. I think it didn't make sense to me that this empire would be a patriarchy, because it was founded by a female being, and it didn't make sense for her to create a patriarchal environment. But yeah, it has been interesting, and I think it will be fascinating to continue to explore that contrast.
Absolutely. If we jump back to dragons a little bit, our favorite topic.
Yes.
The Priory of the Orange Tree has largely been inspired by the myth of St. George and the Dragon. Where does this myth reflect in the story?
I think it actually reflects in a lot more places than people realize, because the various versions of St. George and the Dragon have been very much flattened to the basic facts in most people's imagination. So when you say St. George and the Dragon to most people, they will know a basic story about a man who rescues a beautiful woman from a dragon, they get married and live happily ever after. So I was taught about this story many times at school, because I was raised in the Church of England, and St. George is the patron saint of England as well as several other countries, and he's a figure that loomed large over my childhood. But I always wondered who the princess was, because she doesn't often have a name in the story. So I did research into the history of the legend and went right back to like its very earliest origin. And the earliest one I could find where St. George is contrasted with a dragon, because stories about St. George by himself go back much further. Interestingly, he's actually from a place that is now Turkey, even though most people in England consider him English, which is quite odd. But so in the earliest version, the story is that there is a city being tormented by a venomous dragon. St. George arrives and he offers to slay the dragon, but only if the people will convert to Christianity. And I thought that was actually not very heroic. I was thinking like, oh, so you'd just let them all die if they didn't convert to Christianity, like including the children and all the other people who are being sacrificed to the dragon. Because that's another aspect of the story. There's normally a kind of lottery where people cast their lots every day and one of them is chosen as a sacrifice to the dragon. So I thought that was a little bit weird. And then I decided to look into it a bit further. So why do we think that St. George is English when he clearly wasn't? And I found a fairly obscure version of the story, which was written by an Elizabethan author named Richard Johnson. And he had written this very, very long book called The Famous History of the Seven Champions of Christendom. Nobody has heard of it other than me. Nobody cares about this guy. He was apparently a really big deal in the Elizabethan era, though. Like, he was around at the same time as Shakespeare, so I guess he kind of got overshadowed by Shakespeare a bit. I read this story, and I was absolutely horrified at the person that St. George is. He is incredibly sexist. He's incredibly racist, incredibly Islamophobic. Like, there is a scene where he goes to Persia and commits a massacre of Persian knights just because they're not Christian. It's insane. And the author keeps kind of gaslighting you into thinking that George is a really great guy and that he's just doing this because he's so good. And I was like, this guy is monstrous. I would be terrified if I met this man. There's a scene where he falls in love with a nun. And the nun obviously doesn't want to go out with him because she's a nun. And he threatens to kill her entire family. And then, obviously, she's horrified by this, and she can't she can't reckon the fact that, you know, if she gives up her virginity to George, she'll be breaking her vow, but then she's going to lose her whole family. So she dies by suicide. And then there is a scene where the narrator basically says, obviously George hadn't really been intending to kill her family. And I was like, well, she didn't know that, did she? So it was just insane. So I decided I needed to do something about this. So this story that nobody else but me even knows about. And I decided to write The Priory of the Orange Tree and take aspects from Johnson's story and twist it so that the real people who killed the dragon would be a group of people from lots of different backgrounds, particularly women, coming together to defeat a common enemy, which I think Johnson would have absolutely hated. And actually various aspects from the book, like the orange tree, like the sword being called Ascalon, those all come from Johnson's version of the story. He imagined that when St. George fought the dragon, he did so underneath an enchanted dead, but I feel better.
Do we have another forbidden romance in Priory?
Yes, we do. we never do unforbidden romance. So there is a forbidden romance between two women in Priory. And when I wrote it, actually, I actually thought it was going to be quite risky, because it's a very, very big book, and the main couple is gay. And at the time, there was this idea that lesbian fiction did not sell very well. And the idea behind it was that statistically, most readers are women. And statistically, it is assumed that most of those women are straight. Therefore, they will not be able to relate to a lesbian story. But I did it anyway because it felt right for the characters. And again, I wanted to write an overtly diverse story to fight back against this kind of awful patriarchal world that Johnson had created.
Standalone, but you've returned to this world with more books. What inspired you to do that?
Well, I remember when I wrote Priory, I said to my agent, no, it's definitely a standalone. And he looked at me and he just said, you came to me when you were 20 years old and said that you were writing a 7-book series in the Bone season, and you seriously expect me to believe that you're writing a standalone? And I was like, I am, David, I'm writing a standalone. And I'm telling you that, and I'm right. And then a while later, I had to come back to him and be like, look, I'm not saying you were right, but could you try to sell another one? Because when I was writing Priory, I had to create over 1,000 years of history, because there's a 1,000-year gap between when the dragon is slain and when it's supposed to rise again. So I had to create all of that history. And of course, me being me, I have a very vivid imagination, so I had to put all this detail into these historical events, and suddenly I really wanted to explore them. And there was this war between dragons and humans that I mention in Priory. And I thought that would be just such an interesting period of history to explore. So that's the one that I went back to write A Day of Fallen Night. And then I just realized this world has loads of stories to tell, and I shouldn't hold back from doing that, because I had created this huge world and this timeline and all of these characters. And I could see an arc of a story that went on for a bit longer. So yeah, I broke my word to my agent, and I'm okay with that, and I think he is too.
A Day of Fallen Night feels a lot more tragic than Priory does. Was that intentional, or did anything specific inspire you to make it more into a tragedy?
It was a mix of intention and things that were happening in my life during the writing process. So it was always going to be a tragedy, because it's the hardest period in the Priory world to be alive, was that period. If you're going to have a war between dragons and humans, it's not going to go well for the humans. The dragons are big and scaly and have fire, and we have our tiny little spears, so it's not going to go well. So I knew it was going to be, it's not going to be good. But during the process of writing it, two things happened. First of all, I lost both of my grandparents, and I was no longer a granddaughter because I'd already lost my other set of grandparents. And also the pandemic happened. And also, just purely by coincidence, A Day of Fallen Night was already going to be about a pandemic, because there's something called the Draconic Plague that is mentioned in Priory as happening during that period. But suddenly I found myself writing about a pandemic during a global pandemic. So that was really weird. Like, I couldn't escape from the pandemic. And I also knew that everyone was going to think it was inspired by COVID, even though it wasn't. It was inspired by the Black Death. But I suddenly found myself actually seeing how people react to a pandemic in real life. And in a way, it was helpful that I was writing it, because it was quite cathartic to be able to explore what was actually happening through that mirror. And I was able to reflect on grief in the book, because one of the characters in particular, her life is very impacted by grief and the loss of her child. And I was able to wrestle with my feeling of loss for my grandparents through that character. So yeah, it was always meant to be very tragic and very difficult, but it became more so just because of when it was written. And that's actually another book where I was an unintentional oracle, because it's very much about bodily autonomy. I've never wanted to have children, and if I was forced to be pregnant, I think I would have some kind of extreme mental breakdown. I'm just not meant to do that. And the book is very much about pregnancy and motherhood and women choosing different paths. And by the time the book came out, Roe versus Wade had been overturned in the US, so it was published into that world, like a post-Roe world, and I didn't know that that was going to happen. So that's a weird situation when you're an author. When you're writing a book and when you finished it, the world could still drastically change by the time it actually comes out. So you don't know the context that your work is going to be read in when you write it.
What is it like to have this really giant epic fantasy that feels so relevant to our time and age?
I mean, it's kind of a privilege in a way, because I find that a lot of people have connected with the roots of chaos. And it's so lovely to be able to visit countries all around the world and have people tell me that they saw some aspect of themselves reflected in the book, or that the book helped them to get through a difficult period in their life. And people say the same thing about the Bone Season. It reminds me that literature really does connect us all, and that it's so helpful to be able to see your experience kind of described by another person. And it's a big responsibility in some ways as well. I mean, I never try to be preachy in my work. Like, I never want the reader to feel like they're being hit over the head with my political opinions, but inevitably your own politics and your own experiences do seep into a book. And yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting to have that mirror to describe the world through.
There are a lot of dragons in the roots of chaos, and there are also a lot of different types of dragons in the story. What made you decide which one of these are going to be good and which ones are going to be the bad ones?
Well, there is actually a discussion in A Day of Fallen Night of whether the dragons are good and evil. And there's a character who is an alchemist, and he explains that it's more that they're either in harmony with nature or they are not in harmony with nature. So the basic premise of the dragons is that there are two kinds of dragon. There are the fire-breathing dragons, which are called worms, and they're more in line with our kind of European, Christian, Western idea of dragons, like scaly, has wings, breathes fire, associated often with evil, and particularly with satanic evil. You know, Lucifer and the devil, there's beasts in the Bible, like the dragon in the book of Revelation, like it's a very satanic symbol in some ways. And then there were going to be the other kind of dragon, which was more inspired by how dragons are perceived in Asia, particularly East Asia. And there are some stories about dragons, you know, that are not good in those countries, but often they are associated with luck and benevolence and imperial power, and they're often associated with water as well, rather than fire. And I've always found that contrast very interesting, like how did we get two such entirely different ideas of what a dragon is? And I thought that I would base the magic system in the book on that contrast. So we have the magic that comes from the fire in the core of the world. That creates the Western fire-breathing dragons. And then there's a comet that comes every so often that creates the water dragons. And I liked the idea. I had to think of why would one of them be destructive and the other one would not be. and it's because the water dragons are in harmony with nature. They are in balance with nature. They're kind of neutral, essentially, like they have no effect either way. Whereas the Western dragons are born from too much magic, and that magic therefore becoming chaotic in nature. And they are destructive. And there's actually a scene where one of the characters says to one of the fire-breathing dragons, you know, why are you so destructive? Why are you trying to destroy the world? And it just is his nature. Like he doesn't really have enough of a sense of sentience that he can see past it. He just says, all must burn. Like that's his whole driving force. And you will find out at some point why the dragons became chaotic, but that's one of the big mysteries of the series, like what is the root of chaos?
So we get no spoilers.
No.
The Roots of Chaos and the Bone Season both have magic, but they are quite different one from each other. Did you have any difficulties between switching between the two?
I think it does help that they're so different, so I don't really have mental trouble distinguishing them. And I'm very strict about working on them separately. I can't work on them at the same time. That's more to do with I like to get completely immersed in each world. I don't like the sense that I have to pull myself out of one world and into the other. And the magic systems are intentionally quite different. So in the Roots of Chaos, the world is very big and very complex. So I wanted to keep the magic system much simpler. So it's a very basic contrast. It's based on the concept of as above, so below, like a very basic system of balance. You have the fire magic and the star magic, and they have to be in balance. And if they are not in balance, then bad things happen. So it's fairly easy to understand. The Bone Season series has a more complex magic system because although there is a lot of world building, the world is fundamentally one that the reader recognizes. Like, you know what London is, you know what Paris is, you know what Rome is. You're kind of with me when I describe those things. You might not know those cities really well, but you can probably conjure a basic image in your head of what Rome is. So I felt like I had a bit more room to make the magic system more complicated. I think if you make every aspect of a book complicated, it gets overwhelming. But in this case, I had a bit of room to play. So the Bone Season, the magic system is based on different kinds of divination and clairvoyance. So what I did was I made a list of every kind of power I could think of in kind of legend, in folklore, about connecting with the spirit world and telling the future. And I tried to think of what made them different and similar to each other. So I created the 7 orders of clairvoyance, which is there's one order for divination with objects like tarot cards, crystal balls, that kind of thing. There's one order for organic objects like people who use ice or water or wine. You have mediums who are kind of based on Victorian ideas about spiritualism and kind of like evoking spirits. And then you have my main character who can shoot her spirit out of her body. So there's lots of different types, but I still tried to make it easy to understand by having these clear categories.
Do you have a favorite type of clairvoyance?
I think my main character's type is really cool. It's called dream walking, and it's the basic kind of power is her ability to jump out of her body and possess somebody else, which is very cool, but it's also very hard on her body because when she leaves her own body, she can't breathe. So she has to have like an oxygen system to keep her alive. I think I would probably be a psychographer, which is somebody who gets possessed by the spirit of a writer and is then compelled to write for like hours and hours at a time. That would actually be quite helpful for me. And there's also bibliomancers who use books to tell the future. So I think those are cool as well.
Epic. Which character or characters were the most elusive to write and did not behave how you expected them to?
Well, I really like it when characters don't behave how I expect them to, because there is a point at which a character develops a will of their own, and I can put them into a situation and they'll be like, no, I wouldn't do that. I call it the quickening of the character, where they get that life, and it means that I've built a good, complex, solid character when that happens. In terms of being elusive, I'm not sure that I'd call any of my characters particularly elusive. There were definitely characters who were it was a bit harder to get into their heads because they were so unlike me. So some characters, you know, I have a character called Nicholas, for example, who is a 64-year-old gay man, which I am not. But so initially I was thinking, like, can I even write Nicholas? Because I'm not 64 and I'm not a gay man. So am I even going to be able to know how Nicholas, you know, what life is like for Nicholas? But I knew that I had to do that because the story didn't work if it wasn't about lots of different people from different backgrounds, almost none of which I share. So I would always look for things that made me similar to the character. And I find that with Nicholas, for example, he and I have a similar sense of humor and a similar kind of uncertainty around religion. So I always look for things that can help me tap into that character, even if I'm not particularly similar to them on the surface. I look for that character's fundamental humanity and what aspects of their humanity overlap with mine. So yeah, I don't think anyone was particularly elusive. There are certainly characters who are deliberately written to be mysterious that you will find out more about.
Are there any characters in your stories that haunt the narrative?
Haunt the narrative?
Yeah.
Yes, there's two characters from the Roots of Chaos who definitely haunt the narrative. So one of them is called Caliber. And she is based on a witch from Richard Johnson's version of St. George and the Dragon. She's actually almost entirely disappeared from the modern version of the story. I don't think most people realize that the original St. George and the Dragon had a witch in it. And she's a very evil witch who, like, kidnaps children, and she raises St. George as her own for 14 years, and then he kills her. And I decided I wanted to do something more interesting with her than what Johnson was doing. So she's kind of appears in the main Roots of Chaos installments doing various mysterious things, but we still don't know quite why she's doing them. And then there's a similar character called Neporo, who is kind of a similar role, like she's immortal and she has this mysterious past, but no one quite knows who she is or what she was doing. So I'm going to be writing a book that focuses on those two characters at some point, and I think that'll be a really exciting book.
So the standalone really didn't happen. You can't escape this world.
No, no. I mean, I like to write them as much standalone as possible. So you can technically pick up any Roots of Chaos book at any point in the series, and you should be able to kind of still get into it and understand what's happening. But yeah, they very much link together to form an interconnected narrative.
The fantasy scene has always been very male-dominated in the past. What has it been like being a female author on this scene, and do you feel like anything has changed, let's say, in the last decade?
Oh yeah, so I was published in 2013. And back then there was still a lot of surprise about strong female characters, and all anyone could ask me about for about the first 3 years of my career was strong female characters. Why do you write these strong female characters? It drove me insane after a while because it was just all I was being asked, and anyone who wrote a strong female character was constantly asked about it. I even had a really bizarre interview when I was in Madrid, and this guy said to me, like, so everyone's writing strong female characters, and I was like, And then he said, but you wrote a weak female character. And I was so offended. I was so offended. But I was so shocked that I actually didn't ask him what he meant. To this day, I'm so frustrated that I didn't ask him what he meant. I think he probably meant that Paige, the main character of the Bone season, has I think it's because she has a vulnerable moment where she is in love with her best friend, but he doesn't love her back. So she gets very emotional and she ends up going to a nightclub and trying to have a one-night stand with this guy. And I think that interviewer interpreted that vulnerability as weakness. And it's something I used to find really frustrating, because if a character showed any kind of weakness or vulnerability, it was perceived as weakness. And I just hated that. And that went on for about 5 years, which was exhausting. And then slowly, like more and more female fantasy authors started coming in and kind of changing the scope of the genre. I think it really started with young adult fiction, actually, because you had authors like Leigh Bardugo and Cassandra Clare who completely were dominating that side of the industry. And now there's a lot of female fantasy authors. And I think that there's much more, I think there is to some degree more understanding of female characters' vulnerability and complexity. I do think there is still quite a lot of judgment of female characters, though, in a way that there is not of male characters. I think that people are very critical of female characters in a way that I do think is related to misogyny. But no, you certainly can't say anymore that it's a male-dominated genre. I mean, obviously the really heavy hitters are still people like George R. R. Martin, Brandon Sanderson, and so on. But there are authors who have huge fandoms who are women, and I think that it's great that we see much more gender equality in the genre now.
Which female authors would you say are an absolute must-read?
Oh my God, Tasha Suri is one of my favorite authors of all time. I will just put my hands up and say that I'm friends with her, but I wouldn't recommend her work unless I actually meant it. So she wrote an amazing novel called The Jasmine Throne, which is just an absolutely fundamental like fantasy text. It's like epic fantasy inspired by the epics of ancient India, and it's sapphic, and it just means so much to me. It's absolutely phenomenal. I would say N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season is
absolutely
that one's another like totally fundamental text that I think if you were studying fantasy, you should definitely go to that one. Sarah El-Arifi is another one. So she wrote an incredible trilogy called, starts with The Final Strife, and then she also writes romantasy. She has a romantasy called Feybound. I could go on all day. If you follow me on Instagram, I'm always recommending female authors.
What are you reading right now?
I have just finished another amazing female-authored epic fantasy. It's called A Snake Among Swans by Hannah Kaner. And it's a reimagining of Hans Christian Andersen's The Wild Swans, but it's incredibly like feminist. It's like set in a patriarchal world. It's quite brutal. It's kind of like grim, dark fiction, but it's about women overcoming patriarchy, and it's absolutely phenomenal. I love it.
That sounds great. You started writing when you were very young and publishing books when you were pretty young. Do you feel like there has been a specific pressure on you because of that?
Yeah, so my experience of being published was really weird and unusual. So I wrote The Bone Season when I was 19. I sold it to Bloomsbury when I was 20, and it was published when I was 21. And because I was so young, I caught the attention of the international media. So if you Google me, there will be a lot of weird articles. Like you'll see me in like Vogue magazine and the New York Times magazine and all of these like really scary, huge publications. I was on the Late Late Show in the US. You know, I was doing like things that actual celebrities do. And I found that really difficult because I was very, very shy at the time. I was really, really socially anxious. And I was suddenly having to talk to journalists and you know, TV hosts. And I was on like Australian morning TV and just all of this. I mean, it was incredible and I was very lucky, but it was totally not what I was expecting. And I also got given this nickname, The Next J.K. Rowling, which is kind of a crazy amount of pressure to put on a young person because, you know, J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter was such a phenomenon. It cannot be matched, I don't think, by most living people. Like, it was a once-in-a-generation phenomenon. And I think that the idea of putting on the shoulders of a brand new young author to say that you're going to be the next J.K. Rowling is kind of crazy, actually. And I used to say to reporters, like, no, you guys expected it to. So I'm actually much happier now that that time has passed. It was so much pressure. I ended up having a nervous breakdown over it when I was at uni because it was just too much. And I always really hate it whenever I see like a young person get called like the next so-and-so. Like, you know, other authors have since been called the next J.K. Rowling, or you might see like a promising young footballer be called the next David Beckham or something. And I just think it's stupid. Like, just, it puts so much pressure on people unnecessarily. I just think we should let young artists shine by themselves.
Absolutely. You do a lot of research for your work. What has been a fun or favorite discovery that you've made?
So a weird research fact I quite enjoyed, which was for A Day of Fallen Night. I was looking up, I think I was looking up Joan of Arc, and I found out that during the medieval era, specifically, so people would just wake up and suddenly think they were made of glass. And there was one king who had this, and he was so convinced that he was made of glass and that if anyone touched him, he would shatter, that he built like an iron cage for so his internal organs wouldn't break. So I found that weirdly fascinating. It's called the glass delusion. Very, very strange. It's not really seen in the modern day at all. It was just very specifically for like rich European medieval people. So that was kind of weird. And then one of my favorite research stories that when I'm very determined to do my research properly. When I was in Italy, I went to the island of Capri to do some research, and it was specifically to see the Blue Grotto, which is a beautiful sea cave in Capri. So I went there really early in the morning, and what you do is you wait in line, and some Italian guys will come along with these little rowboats, and they will take you inside the cave. And it's got a very, very low entrance, so you have to lie back in the rowboat. And I got there, and the guy said, "I'm really sorry, like the tide is too high, so we can't take you." And I was only in Capri for one day because it's really expensive, so I missed my chance. And I was so determined that I wasn't going to waste my time that I jumped into the sea, fully clothed. Like, I did not have a swimming suit with me. Jumped into the sea, fully clothed, and I swam up to the mouth of the cave and I had my phone. I was like trying to swim and hold my phone in the sea. So it's not a pool, it's the proper sea with waves, and I'm trying to hold my phone without my phone getting wet, just so I can take some photos of the cave. At which point I had to get out, and I was soaked to my skin. I hadn't thought about this. I had to spend the whole rest of the day walking around the island, soaking wet, with people staring at me, being like, who is this insane wet girl walking around the island? So that's the kind of weird stuff I will do for research. Like, I will just jump in the sea fully clothed.
That's commitment. If you could translate any of your works into a different medium, which medium would you pick and which story?
I would love to see the Bone Season either as TV or a video game, actually. Like, I've always loved gaming since I was a kid. Like, as long as I can remember, like, even when I was really little, I used to sit on my dad's lap while he played Tomb Raider, and I would, like, hold the joystick. So I'd love the Bone Season as a video game. I think it'd be really cool. But I would also love it as a TV show. I mean, I would obviously like the Roots of Chaos to be made, but I think it would be so expensive, because if you think about how expensive Game of Thrones was with only 3 dragons, Roots of Chaos has a lot of dragons. And not only does it have a lot of dragons, but it has a lot of other kind of mythical creatures. Like, it has basilisks and all kinds of other things. It has giant mongooses. Like, it would be so expensive to make it. And really, honestly, I'm not sure that Hollywood is ready to spend that much money on a gay movie. I think maybe if it was straight, they might, but I think that they would assume that conservative audiences would reject it and it wouldn't make enough money. And Hollywood's had this problem for years. You know, it will make gay movies if they're cheap, but it won't risk a lot of budget on it. So I'm not expecting it to be made into a movie or any like big projects at any point in the near future. I think Bone Season has more of a chance because although it has a lot of gay characters, it's quite straight passing. So I think it could get away with it better. So yeah, if it could be made into a TV show or a game, that would make my life.
Is there like a specific scene from your books that you would really, really love to see on the big screen?
I mean, there's obviously the romance scenes would be amazing. Like, I really love scenes that are like very intense conversations between 2 characters. So there's a bunch of scenes from the Bone Season where Paige and Arcturus are just talking that I would just love to see in the setting of Oxford. Like, I think they would look amazing. And also there is just a crazy battle scene in the 5th book. I don't normally like writing battle scenes. I find them actually weirdly boring. But I loved writing this scene because it is so unhinged. Like, it is the characters like rushing across Rome, fighting like weird monsters in the Vatican. it's just completely over the top and mad. And I loved writing it, and I think that would look so brilliant on screen. So that would be the one I wanted to see, I think, the Battle for Rome.
That was a really intense scene.
Yeah, and then there's like a fight in the Colosseum. And I just said it in the Colosseum because it was fun. There was no other reason to do it. So yeah, and there's like the Colosseum's like, you know, crumbling and like somebody's throwing bits of it around. So yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun.
But if it was a video game, would that also be the scene that you would be most interested in playing out?
I think with scenes in the video game, like there's so many ways I can imagine them doing the video game. So I think that you could have Paige doing stealth scenes, you know. I think the spirit fighting would be interesting to see in a video game. I've actually, because I'm such a nerd, I've already written out like a whole document about what I want the video game to be like. I just need to find a studio who will listen to me. But yeah, I've imagined like all the scenes, like, yeah, the spirit combat, learning to power up Paige's ability. Like there's all kinds of things I could picture that would be really cool.
What do you think is unique to video games as a medium of storytelling?
I guess it's the level of interaction. Like you are controlling a character in a video game. And with a book or a TV show, you are watching a character, you're observing, but you can't affect the narrative. I mean, if you look at some video games like, I don't know, like Telltale's The Walking Dead or something like Baldur's Gate 3, you are controlling the narrative. Your choices actually affect the outcome of the story. So I think that's what makes them unique. And I always get a bit frustrated when people don't think of video games as being like engaging with narrative. Like they'll say, oh, you know, kids are just wasting time, like they should be reading or something. And obviously I'm a huge proponent of reading. Like that's what I want. I want kids to read. But I also think that video games can be a really fun way for people to engage with narrative. And it's still learning the art of storytelling. And, you know, I could never get my younger brother to read. It's like one of the big failures I feel as an older sister. Like I tried my best, but the guy's just not interested in reading. But he does love video games. And every single weekend, my brother and I play video games together. And it's like, it's a fun way for him to still understand storytelling as a medium. So yeah, I think the uniqueness is the choice and the interaction and how you're choosing to play. Like even if it's quite a fixed story, you're still choosing what direction to send the character in. You're still choosing how to fight an enemy. So there's a level of personal engagement that is lacking in other mediums.
Speaking of that, recently there's been an announcement for a Baldur's Gate book about Astarion. You've played Baldur's Gate. Is there like a specific character that you would be interested in exploring if you were to write a book about it?
Yeah, Minthara. I'm going to be honest, like they actually offered it to me, but I just could not find a time in my schedule because I'm fully booked up for the next few years. If it's still an option when the Bone season is finished, I might go back and ask them if I can still write it because I was so flattered that they offered it to me. But yeah, Minthara is one of my favorite characters, and I know that she's not like one of the origin companions, but I love drow culture. Like I find it so interesting that they're from this like evil matriarchy. And I love her relationship with Orin, and I just found her really interesting, especially when you're playing a good character, which I normally do. I'm currently trying to play an evil run with my friend Tasha, but I was like, I can't do this alone. I need help because I don't like being evil in a game. I'm such a goody two-shoes. So with Minthara, it's very much like I can change her kind of approach. But I love her. I think she's great.
If you could pick a character from like either your stories or any other book or movie or video game to grab a coffee with, who would you pick?
From mine
or from any other books that you read?
I think from mine it would be Arcturus, just because he's been in my head for such a long time. Like, I mean, I think I'd be really shy if I met him. Like, I'd just be like really weirdly nervous. But yeah, he would be the one. I guess I'd say Minthara, but I feel like she'd just kill me. So, like, I would be happy to be killed by her, but I don't feel like it would go very well.
Are there any video games that you've been particularly enjoying recently?
I'm actually replaying Shadow of the Colossus, which is one of my favorite games that I played years and years ago, but they remastered it. I'm a big fan of like remastering games when the technology is better. And something I love about Shadow of the Colossus, it's like a Japanese Sony game. And it's quite a basic story. Like you just have to defeat these 16 colossi. And it kind of, there's like an evil god involved in it. But the narrative is very, very minimal. But it's still very haunting and sticks with you. Like there's about 3 named characters, I think, not including the horse. So it's just, there are very few characters, very, very minimal narrative beats. It's just about you have to save this girl from the dead by killing these colossi. But it's still so effective and so emotional, and I think it just shows that even a very sparse narrative, when done well, can be incredibly moving.
Okay. I am afraid that we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining me, Samantha. I had a good time. I hope everyone else had a good time as well.
Thank you.